We're now being joined by Nabil Al-Tikriti, who is a professor of Middle East history at the University of Mary Washington. Nabil, welcome to the program. What was your reaction when longtime arch rivals decided to end years of hostilities and, work together, all this mediated by China?
I have to admit, I was quite surprised, as I think many people in the U.S. were, because as far as I could tell, there was no lead up to this whatsoever. So it blindsided at least those who are not in the intelligence services who might have known about it. But at least at the public level, nobody here had any idea it was coming.
Nabil, what is the impact of this deal going forward, and what does it mean for China to be labeled a mediator?
Well, it strikes me as a victory for Chinese diplomacy, which is not a sentence that I've heard quite a lot of in my lifetime. They can position themselves as peacemakers, which puts them quite strongly at odds with the way that the U.S. foreign policy has played out in recent years. In fact, the way the U.S. diplomacy has played out ever since 2003, I might argue. And by the fact that the Chinese are putting themselves out as peacemakers in a region that has not seen a lot of peace in the last generation is very positive both for China, but also quite positive for the region, or at least potentially positive. And I think it's quite negative for both U.S. interest and for Israeli interest, at least at the moment.
Nabil, the United States has welcomed this deal, but they say, and I quote, however, they remain skeptical if Tehran will meet its obligations. What do they mean by that?
Well, I suspect what they mean is that they don't trust that Iran will deliver what they promised to Saudi Arabia. But in the specifics, I'm not sure what they mean, because most of the deal, as I understand it, is just restarting the relationship that the two countries had prior to I think it was 2016, when relations were broken off. So I'm not sure what the obligations even would be, except maintaining normal diplomatic relations, normal trade relations, and acting as normal neighbors, which is what they kind of were before. Although, mind you, throughout history, there's a long history of dispute between the ancestors of today's Saudis and the ancestors of today's Iranians.
Nabil, what's the significance of this deal going forward? And I want you to also mention the role of Israel in all this, because Netanyahu says he wants full diplomatic ties with Saudi Arabia, expanding on deals reached with the UAE and Bahrain in 2020 under U.S. brokership.
The way I see it, there was a real push under the Trump administration to unify the Gulf Arabs together with Israel through the Abraham Accords, which was announced, I believe, in 2017. And it was a strong diplomatic push, and it was to try and get them to work with the Israelis in a very above-board, legal, diplomatic way, as opposed to under the table, which has really been true for decades, I would argue. But this initiative is not the same priority that the Biden administration has. The Biden administration, and the way to think of that is to go back to the Obama administration when Biden was the vice president. They prioritized normalizing relations with Iran back then. And then Trump went the complete opposite direction and almost started a war with Iran by assassinating Qasem Soleimani in January of 2020. And in effect, tried to distance the U.S. from Iran, break Iran, and assist Israel in weakening Iran and possibly even helping Israel provoke a conflict with Iran. That's the way things had been heading. Under the Biden administration, priorities have changed. I wouldn't say the overall desires have necessarily changed, but the priorities have changed. And the biggest change is what happened when Russia invaded Ukraine.
Right.
That turned everything from the Middle East in general to Eastern Europe. And it got down to the level of where funding in education went. So instead of funding education in Turkish, for example, they shifted it over to Russian at the level of higher ed state funding. So it's throughout the federal bureaucracy that they turned everything on a dime from Middle East to Eastern Europe. And in effect, this is one of the knock-on results of that turn in policy, in addition to going all the way back to the Obama policy of trying to normalize things with Iran,
right,
and not prioritizing Israel.
Okay, we have to end this discussion here. I've been talking to a professor of Middle East history at the University of Mary, Washington. His name is Nabil Al-Tikriti. Nabil, thank you very much for giving us time today.
Thank you very much for having me.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.